I hope you're looking forward to a great new year. This is the last reading that we'll have in 2021. It's hard to believe 2022 is already upon us. So I hope you have really resolved to continue through the New Testament. Continue to resolve to continue through the major prophets in 2022. We'll be going to about next December, 3 or 4 days a week. So I pray that you continue to do that and that you find this, again, edifying and educational and equipping for you. Today, we are in chapter 17 of Isaiah, another oracle that's spoken against or spoken about areas surrounding Judah and Jerusalem, which is Isaiah's major focus. This time on the city of Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, which is north of Israel. Syria today, of course, continues to exist. Syria is in the news regularly as a hotbed of attacks against the northern part of Israel. They continue to oppose them as they did in ancient times. Syria was also manipulated by the empire of Assyria. It's easy to get them confused, and continues to this day to be dominated by forces from Iran, as well as Turkey and Russia. So we see the hegemony, we can say, the domination of this country by foreign powers opposing Israel continues today. So let's look at chapter 17 here, an oracle. Again, something that Isaiah has a compulsion to unload. I think of Paul sometimes about his words about preaching the gospel, that woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. He's got an oracle. He's burdened to do it. So this event that it's talking about is the crushing of Syria and northern Israel, Samaria. The 10 tribes in the northern kingdom were allied with Syria against Assyria, so that when Assyria attacked Syria, they rolled down into northern Israel, right up to, it turns out, Judah and Jerusalem, which God continued to protect. So we see that here. This happened in about 732, and Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. It says the city of the Arar are deserted. They will be for flocks which lie down, and none will make them afraid. So it's going to be so desolate, that area, and that's pretty far down into Israel, northern Israel. The area is going to be so desolate that flocks there are not going to be disturbed by anything. They're going to rest quietly in this area. So the fortress will disappear from Ephraim. So Ephraim is a word, one tribe that's used to stand for all the tribes of the 10 tribes in northern Israel. So when you see that word Ephraim, look to the context. Sometimes it's talking about that specific tribe, but more often, and here it is as well, it's talking about those 10 tribes. And the fortress is going to disappear, and the kingdoms from Damascus and the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. In other words, that whole area, Damascus, Syria, northern Israel, they're all going to be scattered. They're going to be taken into captivity. They're going to be taken out of their land. That's what he's saying there. Why Ephraim with Syria, with Damascus? Because, as I said, they made the mistake of becoming into a foreign alliance with Syria and put themselves under the assault of Assyria as a result of that. So the Lord is warning Judah and Jerusalem not to enter into these geopolitical agreements with the nations around them, because those nations are coming down and they need to depend on the Lord alone. That's the message of this section. So the glory of Jacob will be brought low, the fat of the flesh will grow lean, and it shall be as when reapers gather standing grain, and his arm harvests the ears, as one gleams the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. So this valley was east of Jerusalem, very fertile place. Lots of harvesting went on there, and what he's saying here is that these northern tribes are going to be harvested like that valley, that it's going to be picked over clean. What's going to be left for the gleaners is just a slight remnant, which we know happened after the Assyrian invasion in 722, and then this further invasion in 732. It says only gleanings will be left in verse 6. So that first 6 verses there are really talking about the ruin of Syria, the ruin of Damascus. Damascus stands for Syria. The ruin of Ephraim. Ephraim stands for the northern 10 tribes. And it's all brought about because these northern 10 tribes entered into a covenant, a pact, an agreement, an alliance. After verse 6, then, we get into verse 7, and we start seeing some of the reasons that God has brought this on them. In that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, to the works of his hands. He will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. So Asherim were pagan areas of worship to Baal, as were the altars of incense. This Assyrian assault that's going to ruin the northern 10 tribes is ultimately going to cure them of their idolatry, which has brought this on them. It said in those days their strong cities will be like deserted places on the wooded heights and the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. So they'll be like barren hilltops. Again, I live in the Rocky Mountains, and I can look out my windows and see this time of year hilltops covered with snow, but oftentimes hilltops that are just covered with bare rock or sand because they're so high and they're above the tree line. That's what he's envisioning here, that these are going to be picked over and look as if they were hilltops with no vegetation, perhaps just sand on them. We drop down to verse 12. We see, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thundering of the sea. The roar of the nations. They roar like the roaring of the mighty waters. So these are coming against the cities of Judah and Jerusalem. So this is the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah hearing the onslaught of the Assyrian army that's sweeping down into even Judah. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. So verse 13 says that God is going to protect Judah and Jerusalem. Assyria is given over to destruction. Syria and Damascus are given over to destruction, but the destruction stops at the gates of Jerusalem. And we'll see that as we get further along in the book of Isaiah. It says, at evening time, behold terror. Before morning, they are no more. So this is depicting a time when Judah and Jerusalem are going to be terrified by this army. And the next day, literally, the army is going to be gone. There'll be no more. And we'll see this literally being carried out later in the book of Isaiah. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us. And what will happen is the encampment of the Assyrians that was outside Jerusalem will itself be plundered, will itself be looted by the men of, and even the most unexpected men from Jerusalem. So again, brothers and sisters, we are seeing here in the pages of the Old Testament testimony after testimony of God's sovereignty over the nations. You know, it's important to remember that the whole Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, is firmly and securely rooted in history. It is a historical document. The prophets, Isaiah and the rest of the major prophets, interpret that history for us, help us to understand that history and see God's hand in it. God's hand continues today in history. When we see the nations in an uproar around us, when we see people wringing their hands, when we see people worried, we need to turn to the God of Israel. We need to turn to the Father, Son, and Spirit that's revealed in the Old and New Testament. And we need to depend on Him, not on alliances with foreign countries, not on our ability to produce, not even on our ability to stand strong and firm, but rather we stand in the Lord. These other things are important. We'll see it later in Isaiah that even when Judea prepared for war, if they prepared for war without also praying to God for protection, they were lost. We're the same way, so let's not give up our times of prayer and continue to pray for our country, the wisdom of our leaders, and for the return of God's Son, Jesus, to the earth. Maranatha, have a great New Year's celebration, and look forward to the next chapter of Isaiah that carries us into 2022. God bless you, brothers and sisters.